My name is Vivian Crawford. I'm 36 years old, and the moment I realized my family could smile while erasing me from it was 2 days before Thanksgiving. I wasn't snooping, and I wasn't looking for a fight. I was standing in the hallway outside my mother's kitchen, still holding a bottle of wine I had brought over out of habit, when I heard my sister laugh in that polished little way she used whenever she wanted to sound charming instead of cruel. Then she said, "Don't invite her. Adrian doesn't need to sit through small talk with someone who just works at a museum." My mother let out the kind of tired sigh that usually came right before she gave my sister exactly what she wanted, and a second later, she did. Just like that, my seat at Thanksgiving disappeared. No argument, no hesitation, no one called my name. A few minutes later, I got the text that made it official. "We're keeping dinner very intimate this year. We'll celebrate another time." Another time. That was how they dressed it up when they wanted to make exclusion sound thoughtful. So on Thanksgiving Day, while my family played warm and elegant for my sister's rising state senator fiancé, I sat alone in my apartment with a reheated meal, my phone lighting up with carefully staged photos of crystal glasses, golden turkey, and the kind of smiles people save for an audience. I told myself I was too old to be hurt by something so predictable. Then, 3 weeks later, my sister called me as if none of it had happened and told me I had to come to Adrian's campaign gala because family optics suddenly mattered. I almost said no. I really should have. But if I had, I never would have seen the exact moment he glanced at my badge, went pale, and looked at her like he had no idea who she really was marrying into. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and what the weather's like there. I just want to know how far my story can travel. I spent that Thanksgiving the way people spend holidays when they're trying not to admit they've been hurt. I kept the television on for noise, let a parade drift through the background, and ate a dinner I picked up from a grocery store because cooking for one felt too honest. Every hour or so, my phone lit up with another photo from my mother's house. My sister leaning into Adrian with that practiced smile of hers. My mother pretending everything looked effortless. My father holding a wine glass and looking uncomfortable in the way men do when they know something is wrong, but have already decided not to interfere. In every picture, there was an empty space where I should have been, and somehow that was the part only I could see. What made it worse was that none of this had happened because I was difficult or estranged or reckless. It happened because, in my family, I had somehow been reduced to a sentence people used when they needed to explain me quickly. Vivian works at a museum. That was the version of my life they carried around. Neat, harmless, forgettable. The truth was that I was the president and CEO of the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, which meant I didn't just work at a museum any more than a hospital director just handed out bandages in the lobby. I oversaw a major institution with hundreds of employees, board members, donor relations, public programming, educational strategy, community partnerships, and a budget large enough that one bad decision could ripple through schools, staff, and families across the city. My days were packed with meetings about STEM access, scholarship initiatives, neighborhood outreach, corporate giving, and long-term planning. I spent as much time talking to philanthropists, educators, and civic leaders as I did walking through exhibits. Some mornings started with breakfast meetings about funding for science education. Some afternoons ended with conversations about how to get more girls into engineering programs, or how to make sure kids from underfunded districts could experience the museum without cost becoming a barrier. I had spent years building a career that mattered to people who might never know my name but would still feel the effect of my work. And somehow, inside my own family, all of that had been flattened into museum job. My sister was especially good at doing that. Celeste had a talent for shrinking other people with a smile so bright you almost missed the insult. She liked careers that sounded expensive when she said them out loud, law, finance, politics, real estate development. Anything that came with a title she could drop at dinner and watch people react to. To her, my work was too public service, too educational, too earnest. It didn't glitter in the right way. Never mind that I managed people, budgets, strategy, fundraising, and citywide partnerships. Never mind that my name appeared in press releases, donor briefings, and invitations she would have framed if they had belonged to her. If it wasn't the kind of power she understood, then in her mind, it barely counted. The worst part was that my mother had let that version of me stand for years. She had never once asked what my job actually looked like day to day. She never asked what it meant to run an institution like mine, or what kind of pressure came with leading something that families, schools, scientists, and donors all depended on. When local outlets covered one of our education initiatives, she texted, "That's nice, honey." When I was invited onto a regional panel about science access and youth development, she said she was proud of me in the same tone people use when a child remembers to bring home a permission slip. It wasn't contempt exactly. It was something stranger and, in a way, sadder. It was a total lack of curiosity. She accepted the smallest possible version of my life because that version fit neatly beside the one Celeste had built for herself. And if I'm being honest, I had let that happen too. Not because I was ashamed of what I did. I wasn't. I loved my work. I believed in it. But after enough family dinners where no one really listened, after enough holidays where my achievements landed with the weight of weather updates, I stopped trying to translate my life for people determined not to understand it. I let them think what they wanted because correcting them felt like begging for a level of respect that should have been basic. So when I sat alone that Thanksgiving and looked at those pictures, I realized the holiday itself wasn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound was knowing my own absence had felt more convenient to them than my presence, all because they thought my life was too small to matter in the room my sister was trying to impress. And then, as if the universe had decided humiliation should never travel alone, Celeste called me 3 weeks later and told me I needed to attend Adrian's campaign gala because the family needed to look united. She said it casually, like she was asking me to bring ice, and by the time I hung up, I understood exactly what I was to her when it suited her. Not family. Not really. Just a prop she had temporarily put back into the scene. Celeste gave me exactly 4 days' notice, which was fitting because consideration had never really been her style. She called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was between meetings and didn't bother with an apology for Thanksgiving. Didn't mention the text. Didn't even pretend there had been a misunderstanding. Her voice came through bright and smooth, as if we were two sisters who spoke all the time instead of two women, separated by a silence she had created and expected me to ignore. She said Adrian's campaign gala was coming up on Saturday, that it would be an important night, and that I needed to be there because family presence mattered. Then, after a pause just long enough to remind me where she believed I belonged, she added, "Just keep it simple. Smile, be warm, don't get into long explanations about work. This night is really about Adrian." I remember looking out through the glass wall of my office at a school group moving through one of our exhibits, children tilting their heads back in wonder at something suspended over them, and thinking that my sister had somehow managed to invite me and diminish me in the same breath. I asked why, exactly, I was suddenly useful now. She laughed lightly and said, "Don't make this difficult, Vivian. We're trying to present a united family. You know how these things work." The truth was, I did know how those things worked. I knew polished rooms and donor smiles and people who spoke in warm tones while arranging each other like furniture. I knew what it meant when someone said optics. It meant the story mattered more than the people inside it. For a few hours after that call, I told myself I wasn't going. I had every reason not to. I had already been dismissed, hidden, and then summoned back like an accessory that matched the evening. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized staying home would only let Celeste keep directing the narrative exactly the way she always had. She would get to decide who I was in that room without ever having to worry about whether reality might contradict her. So I went. The day of the gala, I worked a full schedule at the Institute. We had a planning session that morning about an upcoming donor initiative, a briefing over community outreach metrics, and a late afternoon conversation with a corporate partner about funding a youth science program for public middle schools. By the time I wrapped up, I had just enough time to change from one professional version of myself into another. I traded my work blazer for a black tailored suit that was understated enough not to look like I was trying to make a statement, and sharp enough that I didn't feel like I was shrinking to accommodate anyone else. I pulled my hair back, added earrings I almost never wore, and grabbed the leather card case I carried out of habit. My staff badge was still tucked into my coat pocket from earlier, and I remember thinking I should probably leave it in the car, then deciding I was too tired to fuss over something so minor. That tiny decision would end up mattering more than anything else I did that night. The gala was held in a ballroom downtown, one of those old Philadelphia spaces restored to look timeless and expensive, with high ceilings, warm gold lighting, polished floors, and enough glassware to make every table look like it was trying to impress the room beside it. Campaign banners stood near the entrance. Staffers moved quickly with tablets and headsets. Donors in tailored coats and quiet wealth clustered near the bar, talking in low, confident voices about districts, polling, education, public safety, and whatever else people with influence pretend is casual conversation. By the time I arrived, the evening was already in motion, and Celeste was exactly where she wanted to be, near Adrian, lit by cameras and attention. She spotted me almost immediately, and I watched her face rearrange itself into a smile that was warm enough for observers and controlling enough for me to understand the message underneath it. She crossed the room, kissed the air near my cheek, and stepped back to examine me. "Good," she said. "You look appropriate." Appropriate. Not beautiful, not elegant, not, "I'm glad you came." Just appropriate, like I had passed inspection. Then she lowered her voice and added, "Try not to disappear too long. There are people I want you to meet, but nothing too in-depth, okay?" I said nothing to that because there was no answer she would have heard correctly. Adrian joined us a moment later, handsome in the polished, disciplined way ambitious men often are, every line of him saying he had learned how to inhabit a room before he had ever earned one. He greeted me politely, though with the kind of vague familiarity people reserve for relatives they've been told are harmless and peripheral. Celeste introduced me with a hand on my arm and said, "This is my sister Vivian. She works over at a museum in the city. She's very behind the scenes, but we're happy she could make it." I actually felt something in me go still when she said it, not because it surprised me, but because of how effortlessly she could turn a whole life into something decorative. Adrian smiled, shook my hand, and said he was glad I came. He wasn't rude. That almost made it worse. He had no reason to think he was speaking to anyone other than the version of me Celeste had handed him. For the next hour, I watched my sister do what she did best. She floated from conversation to conversation with an ease that looked natural until you paid close attention and noticed how carefully calculated every laugh was, every touch on an elbow, every nod at the exact moment someone important finished speaking. She used words like service, family, values, education, and community with the polished confidence of someone who knew how they sounded and not much more. At one point, I listened to her describe Adrian's commitment to youth opportunity to a pair of donors as though she had spent years in classrooms instead of years curating her own reflection in other people's approval. When museum access and science education came up in a conversation near the center of the room, Celeste didn't hesitate. She stepped in, smiling, and said something vague about the importance of making culture and learning available to everyone, which would have sounded thoughtful if it hadn't been so empty. I stood a few feet away holding a glass of sparkling water and realized she was doing what she had probably been doing for years whenever my name came up in circles that mattered to her. Borrowing the outline of my work while minimizing the person who actually did it. Every now and then she would glance at me as if checking to make sure I understood my role. Stay pleasant, stay quiet, stay small. I might have played along a little longer if the room had stayed superficial, but then one of Adrian's donors, a woman in a slate blue dress with the posture of someone used to chairs being pulled out for her, turned toward our group and started talking about educational partnerships and civic institutions. The conversation sharpened immediately. This wasn't decorative anymore. This was real. Funding, access, public trust, strategy. The kind of discussion Celeste liked to orbit but had never actually had to carry. I saw the moment she realized she was drifting out of her depth, and I saw the instinct kick in anyway, that old reflex to keep talking before anyone noticed. She started answering a question that wasn't really hers to answer, and before I even thought about it, I shifted the glass to my other hand and reached into my coat for my card case. It was such a small movement, automatic, professional, the kind of thing I had done 1,000 times in rooms far more consequential than this one. I didn't know yet that in less than a minute, one glance downward was going to crack the entire evening open. The woman in the slate blue dress turned fully toward me before Celeste could redirect the conversation back into safer territory. She had the calm, focused expression of someone who didn't waste time on social filler once a topic became real. "And you are?" she asked, holding out her hand. I set down my glass, reached for my card case, and gave her the small professional smile I used in rooms where introductions actually mattered. "Vivian Crawford," I said. "It's nice to meet you." She glanced at the card, and everything about her face changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have drawn the whole ballroom at once, but enough for the people nearest us to feel the shift. Her eyes lifted back to mine. "Dr. Crawford," she said, warmer now, almost surprised. "I didn't realize you were here tonight." Celeste's smile faltered for half a second. Adrian noticed. He looked from the donor to me, then down to the badge that had slipped partly free from the pocket of my coat when I reached for my cards. I watched his eyes focus on the line beneath my name, and I saw the exact moment the story he had been told stopped making sense. His expression didn't just change. It emptied out first, like someone had quietly pulled the floor from under a thought he had been standing on. Then he looked at me again, more directly this time. "You're Dr. Vivian Crawford," he said slowly, as if repeating it would help it settle into place. "President and CEO of the Franklin Institute?" There it was, clear enough for everyone closest to us to hear. I nodded once. Yes. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Then the woman in blue gave a short laugh, not mocking, just genuinely startled. "Adrian, your fiancé never mentioned that her sister was leading one of the most important science and education institutions in the state." Another donor turned, then a campaign advisor, then someone from local press standing a few feet away, already scanning faces for a story worth remembering later. Celeste stepped in so quickly it almost looked rehearsed. "Well, Vivian's always been very modest," she said, laughing too brightly. "She's never been the kind of person who likes to make a big deal out of herself." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The donor was still holding my card between two fingers, reading it again as if to confirm she hadn't imagined it. "Modest is one word for it," she said. "The Franklin Institute's STEM outreach work has been one of the most effective education models in this region." She turned back to me. "We've actually been hoping to connect with your office next quarter." Adrian's face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with calculation happening too fast. He looked at Celeste, then at me, then back at Celeste. "You told me she worked in a support role," he said quietly. It wasn't loud, but in a room like that, quiet could be even more dangerous. Celeste tried to recover. I said she worked at the museum, which she does. At the institute, I corrected gently. And I lead it. That was when the air around us seemed to tighten. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from shock alone. It was the silence that comes when everyone nearby realizes they've just stumbled into the truth behind a private lie. Adrian stared at me for another second, then asked, "You oversee the whole institution?" "I do. Board relations, donor strategy, educational programming, all of it? All of it." The campaign advisor beside him shifted posture immediately, suddenly paying attention in a completely different way. He asked me a question about science access and public school partnerships, and I answered without hesitation, because unlike Celeste, I didn't need to decorate what I knew. I lived inside it every day. I explained briefly how community-based STEM programs worked best when institutions partnered directly with districts instead of building outreach from assumptions. I mentioned transportation barriers, sustained funding, and why trust mattered more than one-time publicity events. By the time I finished, the donor in blue was nodding. Adrian was listening like a man who had just realized the most substantive person in the room had been standing in front of him all night, and Celeste looked as though she had been pushed one invisible step outside the circle she had spent months trying to control. Then Adrian turned to her again and said, with careful restraint that made it cut even deeper, "Why did you never tell me any of this?" Celeste opened her mouth, but nothing convincing came out. And standing there with my name finally saying what it had always said, I realized the room no longer belonged to the version of me she had invented. For the next several minutes, I barely had to move. The room moved around me. That was the first thing Celeste could not control once the truth was out. People who had spent the evening politely skimming past me were suddenly leaning in, asking sharper questions, introducing themselves with more intention, treating me like someone whose time had value. Adrian's senior policy advisor asked whether I had seen measurable gains from after-school science partnerships in underserved districts. A donor wanted to know how institutions like mine balanced public trust with private funding. Someone else brought up workforce pipelines, engineering scholarships, and whether museums could play a role in keeping students engaged before they disappeared from the educational system entirely. Those were not abstract talking points for me. They were my actual work. So I answered the way I always did, clearly and directly, without trying to sound impressive. I talked about access instead of optics, about continuity instead of photo opportunities, about what happened when children saw science as something that belonged to them instead of something locked behind tuition, geography, or family income. I mentioned the partnerships we had built with schools, the mistakes institutions often made when they designed programs for communities they had never taken the time to know, and the difference between one glamorous event and sustained investment. The more I spoke, the quieter the people around me became. Not because I was performing, because they could tell I wasn't. Adrian stood there listening with the expression of a man trying to recalculate an entire evening in real time. It was almost painful to watch, if I had been in the mood to feel sorry for anyone in that room besides myself. Celeste, on the other hand, was still trying to re-enter the conversation every few minutes, and every attempt made things worse. She would slip in a phrase about Adrian's commitment to education or say something vague about broadening cultural access, and the discussion would move right past her, as if the room itself had made a decision. At one point, she laughed and said, "Vivian gets very passionate about this stuff," in a tone meant to make me sound endearing and slightly excessive at the same time. No one picked it up. A donor simply turned back to me and asked if our institution had seen stronger outcomes in schools that involved parents in the programming. I answered him, and Celeste stood there holding her smile in place like it physically hurt. That was the moment I understood something I should have learned years earlier. The people who truly recognized value did not need my sister's translation to see it. The only people who had ever accepted her smaller version of me were the people who found it convenient. Eventually, Adrian touched my elbow lightly and asked whether I would mind stepping a little farther down the room to meet two people involved in educational fundraising. The gesture was respectful, almost formal, but it landed like a public reclassification. I was no longer there as his fiancé's sister. I was someone he needed in a serious conversation. Celeste noticed immediately. "Adrian," she said, with that careful sweetness that always sharpened when she was losing ground, "we still need to make the rounds." He didn't even look at her at first. He was still looking at me. "This won't take long," he said, and then to me, "if you have a few minutes." The difference between those two tones was so subtle most people would have missed it. I didn't. He asked me. He told her. I said yes, partly because refusing would have let Celeste recover too much dignity too quickly, and partly because after spending weeks being treated like something disposable, I found I had very little interest in making myself smaller to protect her. The next conversation only deepened the damage. The two people Adrian introduced me to already knew my name, which did not help Celeste's expression. One had attended a private event at the Institute the year before. The other had followed one of our citywide science access initiatives and asked whether we were expanding into more public school partnerships next year. Adrian listened as I explained where the work was going and what kind of support would make a meaningful difference. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions, real ones, not the kind asked by someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the kind asked by someone realizing he had been standing too close to a serious institution to remain uninformed about it. Finally, when the conversation paused, he looked at me and said, clearly enough for everyone in our immediate circle to hear, "Dr. Crawford, I hope you know how much I appreciate you being here tonight. Your perspective is more valuable than I realized." It was a polished sentence, the kind a man in politics probably knew how to deliver well, but there was something unvarnished under it too. Regret, maybe, or embarrassment. Either way, it hit Celeste harder than if he had raised his voice. Because this was what she had wanted all along from the room: admiration, seriousness, relevance. And now he was handing those things to me in front of people she had spent months trying to impress. She tried once more to pull the attention back toward herself. "I've been telling Adrian for ages how important science and education are to communities like ours," she said with a soft laugh. One of the donors glanced at her, then at me, and said, "It helps when the expert is actually in the room." Nobody said another word after that. They didn't need to. The line landed with the clean force of a door closing. A little later, when the cluster around us finally loosened, Adrian asked if he could speak to me privately for a moment. We stepped just far enough away from the center of the ballroom that the conversation wouldn't carry, though not so far that Celeste couldn't see us. I suspected that part was not accidental. He looked at me with a seriousness that had entirely replaced the polite indifference he'd worn earlier. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I was given a very incomplete picture of who you are and what you do." I met his eyes and said, "You were given the version that was convenient." He exhaled once, slow and controlled, then nodded like a man hearing the simplest explanation and hating how much it clarified. Behind him, across the room, Celeste stood frozen in a circle of people who were no longer listening to her the way they had at the beginning of the night. And for the first time, I think she understood that humiliation feels very different when no one can be convinced to carry it for you. By the next morning, my phone looked like a crisis management desk. Celeste had called 3 times before 8, sent 6 texts, and managed to make every one of them sound like a blend of panic, outrage, and self-pity. Her first message said we needed to talk immediately. Her second said I had blindsided her. By the third, she had fully settled into the version of events where I had somehow chosen to embarrass her, as if I had marched into that ballroom with the specific goal of ruining her evening instead of simply existing as myself for too long in front of the wrong people. When I finally answered, she didn't say she was sorry. She said, "You could have warned me." I actually laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. I told her I hadn't hidden anything. She had. Then I said the one thing she clearly did not want to hear. "I didn't embarrass you, Celeste. I just stopped fitting inside the version of me you built for other people." She went quiet after that, not humbled, just cornered. An hour later, my mother called, crying. Margaret said she never understood how serious my job really was, that Celeste had always made it sound like I handled exhibits and school tours, and that she hadn't realized how much she'd allowed that version of me to stand. That hurt more than I expected. Not because it was new, but because it confirmed what I had suspected for years. No one in my family had really been curious enough to know me if the easier story was already available. Then Adrian called. His tone was careful, professional, nothing like the man I had first met through Celeste's polished introductions. He apologized for his assumptions, thanked me for my grace the night before, and asked if I'd be open to a formal conversation about youth science access and education partnerships. Not dinner, not anything personal. Work, respect, the language of my actual life. By the end of that day, I understood something my sister still didn't. She thought the damage came from being exposed, but the damage had really come from underestimating how expensive the truth becomes once it finally enters the room. The fallout came fast once the gala was over. At first, Celeste tried to act like it had been one awkward misunderstanding, something she could smooth over with excuses and charm. But Adrian had already seen too much. Once he realized she had deliberately reduced her own sister to make herself look more impressive, he started questioning everything else. Within weeks, their engagement was quietly postponed, and not long after that, it was over. He didn't end things because of me. He ended them because the way Celeste treated me showed him exactly who she became when image mattered more than truth. That was the price she paid. She lost the man she wanted to impress, the polished future she had been building toward, and the credibility she had spent years protecting. Adrian, meanwhile, reached out to me professionally and asked to continue the conversation we had started that night about science access and education partnerships. A month later, he publicly thanked me and the Franklin Institute at a civic education event, and my role was listed exactly as it should have been. I didn't need to humiliate Celeste. I only had to keep standing in the truth she had worked so hard to hide. The harder part came at home. My mother called me crying and admitted she had let Celeste define my life for years because it was easier than asking real questions. My father, who had always stayed quiet, finally apologized for letting that happen. For the first time, my family stopped treating me like the daughter who worked at a museum and started seeing the life I had actually built. By the next Thanksgiving, everything had changed. My mother invited me weeks in advance, this time with no excuses, no polite little lies, no attempt to make me feel lucky for being included. When I walked into that house, no one talked over me, no one minimized me, and no one acted like my seat at the table depended on whether I made the family look good. Celeste wasn't there. She had moved out, lost Adrian, and sent me a long message admitting that she had spent years making me seem smaller because my life made her feel insecure. I read it, but I didn't answer. Some apologies come too late to open the same door again. What I learned from all of it is simple. People do not always belittle you because they think you have no value. Sometimes they belittle you because they know you do, and they need you to stay small so they can feel bigger. Never help them do that. Let your work, your character, and your consistency speak for you. The truth may take its time, But once it enters the room, it usually costs the wrong people far more than they expected. If you've ever had family treat your life like it wasn't impressive enough to matter, tell me in the comments. I'd love to know your story too. At Revenge Argon, our team works hard to create meaningful and engaging stories that leave a lasting impression. We are committed to making it clear that this is a fictional story created to share thoughtful lessons and educational value with our viewers. This script carries an important educational message about self-worth, respect, and the danger of judging others based only on appearances. It reminds viewers that real value often lies in hard work, character, and valuable knowledge, not in status or image. Most importantly, it encourages people to keep growing, stay true to themselves, and never let others define their worth.